Hold on to your forks, because a dietary bombshell is about to hit the table. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Health and Human Services Secretary, is reportedly gearing up to encourage Americans to embrace more saturated fats in their diets, a move that's sending shockwaves through the health community and challenging decades of established nutritional advice. But here's where it gets controversial. Is this a bold step toward dietary freedom, or a dangerous gamble with public health? Let's dive in. Kennedy's plan, as reported by The Hill, suggests that upcoming dietary guidelines will emphasize the consumption of saturated fats from sources like dairy, quality meats, and fresh vegetables. The goal? To reshape what's served in schools and beyond. But this isn't just a minor tweak, it's a direct contradiction to long-standing recommendations that have warned against excessive saturated fat intake. Cheryl Anderson, a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and American Heart Association board member, expressed cautious concern. My response was to stay calm and see what happens, because there's no clear indication of how or why this shift would occur. Anderson highlights that advice to limit saturated fats has been a cornerstone of dietary guidelines for generations. And this is the part most people miss: not all experts are entirely opposed to reevaluating saturated fats. Ronald Krauss, a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, whose research has extensively explored these fats, notes that they may be less harmful than once believed. However, he's quick to caution against oversimplification. If Kennedy is going to say we should eat more saturated fat, I think that's the wrong message, Krauss stated. His studies reveal that saturated fats are relatively neutral. Their impact depends largely on what they replace in the diet. For instance, swapping saturated fats for unsaturated fats like olive oil can improve metabolic health, but replacing them with sugars or carbohydrates might actually increase heart disease risk. Here's the crux of the debate. While Krauss argues that arbitrary cutoff points for saturated fats, like the current 10% guideline, lack scientific grounding, Anderson counters that population-level data consistently shows a link between higher saturated fat consumption and increased cardiovascular disease risk. The more saturated fat consumed, the higher the risk for elevated cholesterol, she explained. Yet, both experts agree on one thing: nutritional guidelines should shift focus from individual nutrients to whole foods. People don't eat nutrients, they eat foods, Anderson pointed out, a perspective Krauss supports as more scientifically sound. But here's the real kicker: nutrition science is notoriously tricky to navigate. Ethical and practical challenges make long-term clinical trials nearly impossible. You can't ethically ask people to consume high levels of saturated fats for 20 years to study heart disease, Krauss noted. Instead, researchers rely on observational data, which is harder to interpret. Typically, dietary guidelines take years of rigorous review, with updates every 5 years. But Kennedy's sudden shift seems to bypass this process, raising questions about transparency and evidence-based decision-making. If implemented, these changes could directly impact school lunches and military rations, where saturated fat levels are currently capped at 10% of total calories. Krauss warns that increasing this to 18 to 19% could elevate cholesterol levels and heart disease risk across populations. It's cherry-picking evidence, he criticized, suggesting that while some of Kennedy's points about processed foods are valid, the overall recommendation lacks a solid scientific foundation. So, where does this leave us? Are we on the brink of a dietary revolution, or is this a misstep that could cost us dearly? What do you think? Is Kennedy's approach a refreshing challenge to outdated dogma, or a reckless disregard for proven science? Let's spark a conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below.